For thousands of years, elders and knowledge keepers have used stories to educate future generations. Stories and words can help heal our hearts and make Mother Earth a better place for all people. This is Healing Hearts.
Hello everyone, welcome to Healing Hearts. I'm Tracy Koga. Tonight, we're going to talk about a sense of belonging, but more importantly, being a proud Canadian citizen. So we will be talking about the importance of citizenship and what it means to the Indigenous and newcomer communities. Let the conversation begin on Healing Hearts. Welcome to my very distinguished guest tonight, and let's just say for now it's an all-women panel. Before I begin, I just want to give a big thank you to our sponsor, The Hive. It's a rock climbing, wall climbing facility, and it really is a wonderful way to not only connect, but also to get some great exercise. So thank you to The Hive Winnipeg for being a sponsor of Healing Hearts. Now, I would love to welcome Suzanne Carriere, who is a citizenship judge, and Loretta Ross, who is Treaty Commissioner. Welcome, both of you. We are talking about the importance of citizenship, but also, like I had mentioned before, a sense of belonging, and I guess being part of a community, not only as a country, but just even in your own neighborhood, and as you relate to one another, as you go upon your daily processes. It is different, and not only in this time that we live in. So I would like to first of all maybe go to Suzanne, as your job as a citizenship judge, and congratulations, you're Canada's first Métis judge, and I guess talk a little bit about your duties and what you have seen over the past time as you've been in this position. What has it been like?
To be part of this panel, and happy to finally meet Loretta Ross. I've certainly heard her name many times before, and so happy to have to be sharing this space with you as well. So yeah, I've been appointed as a citizenship judge about 3 years ago, and didn't realize until after the fact that I was Canada's first Métis citizenship judge. We've never had a First Nations or Inuit judge yet, so hopefully that's coming at some point soon. We're a very small group. There's only 9 of us across Canada, and so I am here based in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 land. I'm the only one in Manitoba. I cover a lot of Saskatchewan and Alberta as well. There's no judge in either Alberta and Saskatchewan, so yeah, I kind of cover a fairly decent ground there, but we all kind of help each other out, especially now that everything has gone virtual. And it's been certainly a very, very fascinating job. It's a great role to be in. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to be part of people's, what is such a special and memorable day for a lot of people, and an important milestone in their lives. So that part is really magnificent as well. And yeah, it's just an absolute privilege to be in the role. And it's a 3-year appointment, and I was just recently reappointed just this past June for another 3-year term. So I'll be here till 2024. And yeah, it's been really, really great.
Well, and you have, I guess, done a milestone in incorporating the Indigenous, role in it as part of citizenship too as well. So maybe take us through that experience.
Sure. So I am Métis, obviously. So in the world of citizenship, we often talk about where people come from. So my ancestors came to Canada from France like 400 years ago. And on both sides of my family, some of the descendants of those first ancestors married Indigenous women. So I do have both Cree and Ojibwe ancestry. And so I have relatively deep roots here in Canada, certainly compared to the people that I'm swearing in. I'm French Canadian and I'm Métis. And I definitely try to bring that as much as possible into my ceremonies. So just to give you a sense, so I've said I've been in this for 3 years now, and have got another 3 years coming. but we do so many ceremonies. And I actually just looked at the numbers before hopping on this call. So I've now presided over, well, nearly 1,000 ceremonies. I've presided, it's over 950 ceremonies. And I've personally sworn in over 36,000 new Canadians. So I do have a little bit of a platform, I suppose. It's not a, you know, I'm not a huge social media influencer or anything like that, but I do have a little bit of a platform. So I talk about, and I have some freedom about what I can talk about and what I, you know, what I was going to say what I can't talk about, but I don't know that there's anything that I can't talk about. But in any event, I have some leeway in what I can talk about. So I talk about the things that are important to me. And I do talk about reconciliation at every one of my ceremonies. I talk about how that is a right and it's a responsibility of all Canadians, even new Canadians. So, and I also tell everyone that I'm Métis, and I tell them the same story I told all of you just now about my ancestors coming from France. And the reason I do that is because I want people to know it. I mean, people might not realize that I'm Métis or Indigenous just by looking at me, and I want them to know that. And I think a lot of times newcomers sometimes have already, even before they get here, or sometimes shortly after they arrive in Canada, sometimes they develop some negative stereotypes based on stories that they've heard or things they see in the media or what they're learning from people here in Canada. And so any opportunity I have to present some sort of, you know, to present a positive image, I want to do that. And then talking about reconciliation, like I said, is super important to me. And part of our, obviously, that's the most public facing part of my position is to preside these citizenship ceremonies. But there's other work that I do as well. I mean, we also write decisions, like we review certain applications for citizenship and write decisions. You know, that's the part where I'm just locked away in my office and working on a computer. But then we also do promotional work. So we do go out in the community. We talk to schools or newcomer groups or really anyone who wants to hear from us and talk to them about citizenship and what it means to be a Canadian citizen and rights and responsibilities and that thing. And in those situations also, I try to always bring in conversation about the history of Canada and Indigenous peoples and their the role of Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada's past, because I think there's this tendency to think of Indigenous people as this like long ago people. No, we're still here. We're still here, and we're part of Canada's present, and we're part of Canada's future. So I like to talk about all of that as well, and bring that into my role as much as possible as a citizenship judge.
Well, and what has been the reaction? I mean, yeah, to really come forth and give, like, and I'm going to say the truth, right? Because it is coming from the heart and coming from your lived experience. What has been the reaction from newcomers?
I think it's been overly positive. I think a lot of times newcomers are more receptive to hearing about Canada's difficult and complicated past with Indigenous peoples, because a lot of people are coming here from other countries where colonization is a reality. And I find sometimes newcomers, I mean, not always, but sometimes newcomers are more receptive and are more understanding and more open to having the conversations than people who are born in Canada. And so I've found that really fascinating. That's something I wasn't necessarily expecting when I came into this role. And I've had the greatest experiences, mostly when we were in person doing ceremonies. There's less opportunity now that we're all virtual for just kind of organic conversations to happen, like once the ceremony is done. But when we were in person, you know, I would have these great conversations with people who would come talk to me after the ceremony and say, you know what, I really liked what you said about reconciliation. I didn't know how to talk about it before. Now I know how to talk about it. And sometimes I sit there and going, I can't believe I'm standing here having a conversation with a Kenyan woman, let's say, about how she can talk to her kids about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here in Canada. Sometimes it just really blows my mind, but in my experience, people are very receptive to the message, and they're understanding that Indigenous issues are issues that need to be dealt with. And with everything that's been happening this year and the Kamloops discovery and everything that kicked off, again, I talked about it at all the ceremonies, and people I thought were just wanted to hear about it.
Oh,
and they were happy that it was being addressed. The ones who spoke to me anyway. I mean, I don't get the opportunity to talk to everyone, but those that I do speak with have been very, like I say, very receptive of the message, and very appreciative of having the conversation, it seems.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, they come with wide eyes and open hearts, as opposed to, you know, people that have been born and raised here. You know, obviously, there's a systemic system there going on. You know, no fault to anybody, but I mean, obviously, these things have to be broken down. I'm going to go to Loretta now. As Treaty Commissioner, Loretta, I guess, first of all, explain a little bit about your position here, and, you know, and all of this, and then, you know, we'll get into the discussion. How far have we come? Or not?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Tracy, for the invitation to be part of Healing Hearts. I think this is a wonderful opportunity. And I too am happy that Suzanne and I have finally met, but as she mentioned earlier, I think we've come close, and so now we finally have met, and hopefully this is the beginning of a relationship all on our own here, and the work that we do, and we can certainly support each other in the work that we do. With respect to the Treaty Relations Commission, I'm the Treaty Commissioner of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. And if you can say all of that, you get
a gold star.
Prize. Yeah, you get a prize. But what the Treaty Relations Commission does is it kind of does three things, but it's to build relations between First Nations and non-First Nations people, essentially, because it talks about the treaties that were entered into between First Nations and the Crown representatives. At that time, of course, it would have been British, right? And what we do at the Commission is we talk about those treaties, but we also let people know that there were treaties before, like the first treaty that here we talk about, treaty number 1 was entered 150 years ago, right? This past August 3rd was 150 years of the first of the numbered treaties between the First Nations people in this territory and the Crown, the British Crown. But prior to that, treaties were used amongst First Nations people all the time. And so it was a common way of dealing. It was a common way of formalizing relationships. These numbered treaties just happened to be the ones that were made with the British. And so it's at the Commission, we have an education role to let people know about the treaties, both the numbered treaties and the First Nation treaties. We do research and we do facilitation. So we're out there in the community. There's a number of issues that can happen around treaties, and the Commission can come in and facilitate issues, facilitate dialogue, hopefully facilitate change. You know, like facilitation is a big word, and I think we have some latitude within the organization to go out and work within the community and help people better understand at least the First Nation perspective with respect to treaties. Many of us in the education system that gets the Western view of what those treaties were all about. And of course, two parties entered into those treaties, and we only know about one. So it's learning about that First Nation perspective and understanding what was intended by First Nations people entering into the treaties, and what the ongoing responsibilities and obligations of people are, and how everybody is connected to the treaties, including new citizens to these lands. There is an ongoing obligation, and you know, people need to understand what that is. And so we've in more recent years started to build relations with various newcomer organizations to help understand what that responsibility is. So to understand the history in order to understand their ongoing responsibility. And as Suzanne said, it's not an historic event, but it's something that carries through to today. And I think we need to understand what that is.
So how far have we come Loretta, in bridging this?
Well, not very far, to be honest. You know, I think that if we look at, you know, and I ask you and, you know, Suzanne, think about what you learned about treaties in the school system, right? And many of us will say we didn't learn anything. And that's not quite true, because we did learn about treaties in the classroom, but there was no value placed on what the treaties meant and the significance of the treaties, that it was because of the treaties, first off, that the Crown then could have open up land for settlement. You know, it allowed people then to have homesteads to build their homes. It allowed people to come and settle here from different places, which continues to happen today. It's because of the treaties that, you know, people can come and settle here. And that's a huge benefit, I guess, from the treaties for non-First Nations people. And people forget that. And that's a huge contribution by First Nations people, was to share the land. And there's a lot of misconceptions around treaties. You know, the first and foremost was that First Nations people surrendered their land. And I think if you know anything about Indigenous people, First Nation, Métis, that there's a huge connection to the land. You can't surrender the land, you know, like it's a part of you as a collective and as a nation and as a people. So to surrender the land in that Western legal sense is not a concept that's held by First Nations people. So you have a clashing of different worldviews, and you know, out of convenience, well, let's just not think about the First Nation worldview because it's in conflict with this, and let's just move on with the Western version of what the treaties were all about. And so what we'd like to do at the Commission is say, well, no, you know, in order, if we're in this era of reconciliation, you have to know that other perspective. You have to know what the First Nations people were expecting and intending through sharing their land. And so that knowledge, like, it's a huge gap. People don't know. People don't know. And you see things as simple as when we went through the Truth and Reconciliation process and learning about residential schools, and people's minds were blown that first they existed, that they ever existed, up until what would be recent times in the mid-90s. And now we're finding these huge, like, mass graves and unmarked graves. Like, people, you know, it's unbelievable. But that's just the, you know, in many ways, the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding that relationship and then understanding the treaties.
Well, I know that it is going to take time. Suzanne, listening to all of this now, and you had kind of mentioned it before, like, newcomers often get a tainted view of our history. You know, we're looked upon as, you know, as Canada as a whole, as like, you know, a new land to start anew and, you know, prosper, and everything is at your fingertips. You know, it's like the pearl in the oyster shell kind of thing. What kind of picture is being painted now to newcomers coming over?
I think sometimes people think of Canada, of course, as this fabulous country, right? It's a destination country for a lot of people who are looking to leave their home countries, right? I mean, it's always at the top of the list, or near the top of the list, and for many good reasons. I mean, it's a beautiful country. It's a safe country. We have great healthcare system, education system. There's opportunities for men and women. We have equality, regardless of sex, gender, age. You know, you can just go on and on. Religion, language, whatever. So there's many good reasons for people to come here. And I think sometimes when people come to Canada, that they've, you know, in their mind, it's this utopia, this beautiful, perfect, near perfect country. And I think sometimes people are shocked to see that, you know, the first peoples of this land are treated as subclass citizens, right? So I think that's a bit of a shock for people sometimes. And I think sometimes what happens between newcomer and Indigenous communities is that there's some marginalization on both sides, right? Some disadvantage on both sides. And I think sometimes that creates a little bit of a sense of almost like competition for resources, right? For social safety nets and housing and for employ, you know, like I think sometimes there's some of that going on. So that's some of the things that needs to be addressed. And I think that's being done by some organizations that are geared towards newcomers. That's why we're talking about building bridges between these two communities, because sometimes there is a bit of a gap there. But there's lots of positives as well, and not lots of things that you can look at as being shared experiences, positive shared experience. So both communities are very community focused and focused on the culture, and so those are there's lots of things to build on there as well. But I think on both sides there's lots of great opportunities for better cooperation and integration and relationship building, and like I said, there's lots of good work being done there, and I hope that work continues.
Yeah, no, we definitely have to do that. Suzanne, I was curious, the process of becoming a citizen, what is that?
Sure. Okay. So yes, so people can apply for Canadian citizenship once they've been here for a while. So you cannot arrive in Canada and apply to become a Canadian citizen right away. So the biggest hurdle you have to meet is you have to be in Canada for at least 3 years before you can apply to become a Canadian citizen. So for the most part, that means you have to be a permanent resident at the time that you apply. You have to fill out like you don't automatically become a Canadian citizen. So you do have to apply for it. You have to pay a fee. Criminal record checks are done. We check to make sure that people are paying their income taxes, if taxes are owed, that kind of thing. There's also some language requirements. So these apply to adults that are between 18 and 54, but you need to show that you can read and understand at least one of the 2 official languages here in Canada. And then for the same age group, 18 to 54, there's also a citizenship test that people have to write and pass. It's 20 questions, multiple choice, and you need to get at least 15 correct in order to pass the citizenship test. Once all of the requirements are met, the very last criteria that you have to meet, the last requirement, is to attend a citizenship ceremony and to swear an oath of citizenship. And that applies to everyone who's 14 and older. So, and we take that very seriously. If you show up at a citizenship and you don't say it, you don't get your citizenship certificate. So people from IRCC, so Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, run the ceremonies, and people are checking all the new Canadians to make sure that they swear the oath. And that's the last requirement. So at that point in time, they are no longer permanent residents and they are Canadian citizens. In fact, at their ceremony, they are asked to cut up their permanent resident card, which people have to show that they're permanent residents. So they cut it up at the ceremonies because they are no longer permanent. They come in as permanent residents, but they are no longer permanent residents at the end of the ceremony. So those are the requirements to become Canadian citizens. And maybe this is as good a time as any to talk about the Citizenship Oath.
Yes.
So obviously, well, I don't know if you want to introduce this in some way, but we all know about the calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which came out in December 2015. And the very last 2 relate to newcomers, so number 93 and 94. And I don't have them in front of me, but number 93 relates to the information guide that goes to newcomers to talk about the history of Canadian citizenship. And that guide is, everyone is in agreement now, that guide is outdated, it's Eurocentric, it doesn't present a full or accurate picture of Canada's history. And so there's a push there and the call to action to update that, which has happened. There's been, since December 2015, a lot of consultation. And I think that we're getting close to the release of a new draft. It's certainly been being worked on and there's no kind of date for the distribution of the new guide yet, but it's in the works and it's quite far along as I understand it. Awesome. Number 94 was call to action number 94, urge the federal government to update the oath of citizenship to recognize the rights of First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. So that one, same kind of story. I mean, since December 2015, there's been a few attempts, a few bills introduced in the House to update the legislation, because the oath itself is part of the Citizenship Act. So updating the oath means an actual amendment to the legislation. And then I think both times that a bill was introduced, you know, at some point, and like it languished, and at some point an election was called and it died on paper, I think, is that the expression they use?
Loretta's shaking her head. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Good old politics.
And then a third one was introduced October of last year, I think, and it was moving through the House and it was already in the Senate when Kamloops happened, and then it was fast tracked after Kamloops. So on June 21st, so it went through Senate. I can't remember exactly which day it kind of got third reading in Senate. And then we were kind of all on pins and needles waiting for royal assent, because that's when it becomes official. And then the very next ceremony after that, we'd have to be using the new oath. So on June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day, Bill C-8 got royal assent. And I'm told, or my understanding is that it was kind of a total fluke that it happened on June 21st, because it wasn't the only bill. It just happened to be when the bills got royal assent. But in any event, June 21st got royal assent, and in the evening. And so then that meant that the very next day, all the ceremonies were now going to be using the new oath. So, and then we'd already kind of lined it up. Obviously, we knew it was coming. So thankfully, like I'm so lucky in this role, but I got tapped to do, to preside the very first ceremony with the new oath. So on June 22nd, it was a ceremony based out of Halifax, because of course with time zones and whatever else, they were the first ceremony that was on the schedule that day. I think we had, I can't remember now, maybe 22 new Canadians from 8 different countries. The minister, it was a special ceremony, obviously. So the minister was there. We had an elder there, Kat Krieger, an anthem singer and a performer. And it was live streamed on YouTube. I think it's still available on YouTube, actually. I haven't checked lately, but at some point a few weeks ago, it was still there live on YouTube. And so it was really, really special. Yeah. Aww. So yeah, so now since then, we have a new oath of citizenship, finally.
Wow. Wow. I mean, like, look at, like, that's progress, right?
It's progress.
Yes. And I do have a question for Loretta, coming from our virtual crowd, but I want to right now bring in Art Miki. So we'll let Art in. Oh, he's now calling me. Oh, let me, okay. Oh, I got you, Art. You're on now. Goodbye. Silent mode on. Okay, there you are.
I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. That's all right. Art, meet Loretta and Suzanne. Suzanne was curious, or actually very interested in meeting you, because she now holds a position as citizenship judge. So.
Oh, congratulations, Suzanne.
Well, thank you. Yes, and I saw. I know that you've held this role in the past. Probably, I think I read somewhere for about a decade. Is that right?
Yeah, for 10 years I was there.
Okay. Oh,
but
excellent. Well,
I've been out of it since 2008, so that's over 10 years ago now.
And I was appointed in 2018, and for us, I don't know if it was the same in your time, but 3-year terms. So I've served 1 term, and I've just been reappointed for a second one.
Oh, good for you. Good for
nice
you.
To meet you.
Nice to meet you. Wow, that's great.
So Art, well, I'll come back to you, but we do have a virtual question for Loretta, and it was a topic that I wanted to talk to Loretta about. So segueing on, a question: what is Indian status, and is that like citizenship? Also, can someone have both Canadian citizenship and Indian status, or do they have to choose? So I guess maybe first of all, Loretta, explain what Indian status is.
Okay, so yeah, that's probably the easiest way to do it. Indian status is status that's granted under a piece of legislation, a federal piece of legislation called the Indian Act, believe it or not. And what it does is it defines who an Indian person is, and they do have a definition in there. And so it grants Indian status, and it's a tool used by the federal government, an administrative tool, because they have, and this is arguably, I guess, through the treaties, they do have this relationship and the commitment to First Nations people. They've used the Indian Act as a tool to administer their relationship. And of course, that piece of legislation was a unilateral piece of legislation, not done in consultation with First Nations people on what should be in it. So it was like an internal tool on Canada's behalf to determine who an Indian would be in order to receive benefits or services. So they set out how that, who an Indian would be. And I mean, this is a really long, potentially a really long response to your question, because it's quite complicated. And the Indian Act status provision has undergone a number of revisions, because at one time, for example, a First Nation woman who married a non-First Nation person would lose her Indian status and would no longer be considered an Indian, and in fact would have to leave her community. So there's a long history to Indian status, but I guess the long and short of it is it's not Canadian citizenship. First Nations people also determine who their citizens are as a people, and it's not, it doesn't jive with the Indian Act. So you're talking about different, like they do different things. One is you could identify it as a way of attaining services through the Canadian government. The other is the First Nations people themselves retain, from their perspective, Canada would say, you know, would argue with that, but for the most part, the First Nations people determine who their citizens are. It's just, you could be a citizen and still not be entitled to meet the definition of Indian status, and so not be entitled to services from Canada. So it's a very complicated process and system that, and I don't know if that answers the question. I think we would need a whole, you know, session just to try and explain that, but it's very complicated, and most First Nations people from birth are entitled to be registered under the Indian Act, and most apply because it allows them opportunity to get some services from the federal government.
Wow, so that definitely does sound complicated, and they're two different things, and they're not together at all. I'll maybe get Suzanne to kind of talk later about that. But thanks. We're going to get back to that kind of complicated situation that really does.
Well, maybe I can just.
Yes. Suzanne?
I was just going to say on the second. Oh boy, yeah. I just got a message. My internet connection is unstable. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you though.
We can hear you.
It crackles a little bit, but we can hear you.
Yeah, well, I'll ask my tech guy what you can do, but in the meantime, yeah, just we can hear you, so you're okay. You're just a little frozen, but in a good way. So Art, yeah.
Okay, I'll just, who knows what my face looks like. I'll just say that on the second question, when it comes Indian status and Canadian citizenship, that everybody born in Canada is a Canadian citizen. So they're not mutually exclusive. Even if you have Indian status, you are still a Canadian citizen. They're not, one doesn't exclude the other. So I just wanted to throw that in, that people who are registered, who are Indians under the Indian Act, are still Canadians as well.
Oh, okay. So there you go.
Yeah.
That is good to know.
It becomes I guess, a question for First Nations people whether they view themselves as Canadian citizens. So that's, I guess, from the Canadian side, that's the view. But many First Nations people will say they're not, right? They're citizens of their own and don't partake in that. So that's why I say there's a lot of pieces to the question of citizenship. But
yes, thanks for the clarification. For sure, people are Canadian, but whether they identify that way but they would be treated as Canadians. Anybody born in Canada would be considered Canadian. But I take your point, Loretta, that people that are Indigenous might not identify that way.
Well, definitely. Well, we're learning everything as we go along. So, Art, I'm going to bring you into this conversation. Yes,
sure.
you were in Suzanne's seat 10 years ago. What was it like back then? Not probably what it's quite like now, or is it a little bit of the same, just a little different?
Well, I think the process is still the same in terms of application, writing a test on Canadian knowledge of Canadian. These are requirements that have been in place since the act was, I guess, done. But one of the things I do mention when I was a citizenship judge is to remind our new citizens that there was a time when there were people who were born in this Canada could not be citizens. And I use my family as an example. Japanese people born in this country until 1947, when the Citizenship Act was passed, did not have the right to vote. And as a result, they really didn't have full citizenship. And I use my father as an example, who was born in British Columbia in 1907, and he never became a Canadian citizen until 1948. And I do have his citizenship papers at home to prove that he became a Canadian citizen at that point in time. And it's interesting because many of the people who are becoming citizens assume that these things existed for a long time. But I tell them that citizenship has been a process. It's been a process of development where people fought, who were born here had to fight to try to get their citizenship rights. And that we've at that stage now where the rule is that if you're born in this country, you are a Canadian citizen. But there was a part in time when that was not really it. And so I'd like to share that story with people to just give them an idea of the evolution that's taken place in terms of the development and acceptance of people in our country. Because, you know, new citizens coming here assume that all of these things have existed for a long time and, you know, they're becoming part of a Canadian family. But I'd like them to know some of the background. But the thing that really impressed me when I met many of the new Canadian citizens is how appreciative they are of being accepted in this country and becoming part of it. And, you know, I'm sure, Suzanne, you see a lot of tears and joy. It's a gift. It's a gift for them. It's a gift of life for them. And, you know, as Canadians, we take it for granted. And yet, I think every Canadian should go see a ceremony to see how people appreciate the fact that citizenship means so much. It's more than just a piece of paper. It's a privilege. And a lot of people who come to this country never had that privilege before. So they appreciate it. And so I think it's really important that, you know, that we have this open process of people coming and being able to watch people becoming Canadian citizens. And so, you know, I think it's such an important part of our society in terms of recognizing that, because in some countries, citizenship means you apply and they get a card in the mail. They don't have a ceremony to acknowledge it. Whereas in Canada, in order to receive your paper, you have to attend a ceremony. And although it seems like some people may argue it's mandatory and all that, but I think it's important that they have that process and they go through that process. So I'm not too sure, Suzanne, how you feel about, you know, what you see in front of you these days, but to me, it's been I would say the greatest experience that I've had, because I've had a chance to meet so many people and going to so many schools and being able to share these stories with them and having kids become acquainted with what it means to be a citizen. And I think we don't do enough of that. Anyways, if there are questions, that's fine.
Yes. No. And I see synergies between your story, Art, and Suzanne. So I'm glad that, you know, in 10 years or more so, some things haven't changed. I do have a question, though. Going back to the 20 questions that you have to answer, yes. What are the 20 questions and have they changed? And I mean, Loretta's kind of smiling because, yes, I mean, yeah, 20 questions like during arts. To
a certain degree. Yeah. Well, there is a booklet that people receive, and there it is, Discover Canada. Yeah. Previous to that, there was another booklet. So as long as they work through the booklet, you know, they should be okay. They should be able to achieve it. But I think the one problem that I found, Suzanne, is that there are a number of people who are refugees, who were in camps, never really had an education, come to this country, and although they try to learn the language, in a lot of ways, it's very difficult for them to achieve the level of language you need to answer those questions. Although, if they don't pass the written test, they could bring in an interpreter and meet with the judge. So that's the second phase. But I used to always wonder, you know, for some people, although everyone says it's a fair system, I think somewhat unfair for certain people. And it's not because of their fault, you know, it's the circumstances. And I know I used to meet a lot of the older Portuguese people. When I went to Toronto was a good example. Many of them had been in country for 40 years, but because they couldn't pass, they couldn't read the English, they couldn't apply until they were 65 or 60. I'm not too sure what it is right now. And so they would wait all that time. And I often thought that there should have been another criteria. If you spent at least 25 years in this country, you shouldn't have to go through some of this because of the language difficulties. And so, you know, I mean, there are things in the system that I think, I used to bring it up, but they don't listen anyways. but you know, I used to use this phrase that there's nothing more unfair than equal treatment of, well, I have it on my wall, but it just shows that equal treatment of people who are unequal isn't really equal. Yeah. If you understand what I'm talking about. Being a school teacher and principal, I know that, you know, we have to accommodate differences, languages and all of those things. But when it comes to citizenship, they don't appear to accommodate as many of those things. So I was trying to bring that concept in, but anyways, Suzanne, it's political. Yeah.
Suzanne, is it better now today?
I see some of the same things that Art is talking about. For me, I would say it's more with the Syrian community right now, because obviously there is a lot of Syrian refugees that came here to Canada in 2015. And so obviously they've all been here for 3 years now. And so they're starting to apply for citizenship. And what we see sometimes is the parents who do have to meet the language requirement and have to write the test. Sometimes they're not able to meet those requirements, but children don't have to meet those requirements. So I see it quite often in ceremonies where a group of Syrian children are becoming Canadians and their parents are there, but they're not getting their citizenship that day because their language isn't quite up to snuff. I don't know if there's other opportunities for just to take the test orally or something like that, for instance. But in terms of what the questions are, I mean, this is the guide right now. Like we spoke about earlier, the guide is under revision and there will be a new guide coming out shortly. But even after the new guide comes out, the questions will still be based on this for a little while, just for a transition period. And I think there's a couple of sample questions in here, or on the Immigration Refugee Citizenship website, you might be able to do kind of a practice test there. But yeah, no, we don't give out the questions ahead of time. There are 5 different versions of the test as well. So you know, so there's no opportunity to copy on your neighbor if you're writing in a class, in a room with other people. But yeah, it's questions that if you study the guide, that you should be okay. And that is one other thing, actually, that we talked about the guide being rewritten because of how Eurocentric it was and the lack of Indigenous content. That was one of the reasons. It's not the only reason. There's some thought that the language of the guide is a little bit too elevated, and like Art says, for some people who have language difficulties, that just ends up being a barrier to them if they can't understand what they're reading in the guide. So there is a push as well to get the language in the guide to be at the same level as what the minimum requirement is for new Canadians. So all of that is being looked at, and hopefully will all be addressed in the next version of the guide set to come out.
It's an organic thing. So I'm going to now go to Loretta, because there is another question here. Is there somewhere we can learn more about what Indian status is and what it truly means? And you can answer that question, and then I want to get on to talking to you now. You know, we know now Canadian citizenship, anybody born here is a Canadian citizen, but then there are Indigenous people that choose not to recognize that, right? And then they have Indian status.
So for the first question, you could probably go to the Government of Canada's website. I mean, they have, they administer the Indian Act and the provisions under the Indian Act. So it's Indigenous Services Canada website. I wouldn't know the exact, but if you Google it, it should come up, and they'll have different sections there pertaining to Indian status. There's not a lot of places other than the Government of Canada, perhaps, that you could find on Indian status. Google may pull up some different things for you, but organizations don't tend to spend a lot of time on that in that area. So that it's limited. But I mean, it's limited in terms of organizations, but the internet is probably your best place to go if you want to learn more about Indian status, and of course the Government of Canada website.
And is there any way of bringing the two together, or is that not?
The two in terms of Indigenous citizenship and Indian Act? No. You know, in 1985, the provisions that I had referenced earlier, where a First Nation woman married a non-First Nation and she lost her status, that issue was litigated, and eventually it was changed in 1985, and it resulted in amendments to the Indian Act and those provisions in terms of women didn't lose their status anymore when they married a non-First Nation. And there's a lot of other things that were attached to that. And so what the Government of Canada did at that point was they said, okay, you First Nations, you can also have your own, what they called membership codes, or people that you want to be part of your community. But you have to accept all of these other people that we've already identified as Indians. So, you know, there were a lot of issues, and a lot of First Nations did, because they wanted to have people that didn't necessarily qualify as Indians under the Indian Act, but that had strong connections to the community. They wanted to recognize them and to bring them in. So you have in some communities what they would refer to as a membership code. And then you would have people on that list, and then you have what would be called a band list, which is administered by Indian Affairs. And then you would have also the First Nation people who have recognized their citizens regardless of the Indian Act, because those membership codes had to bring in people that weren't necessarily tied to that community at one time, but had married in. So there, you know, it's a very complicated system and process. And again, a lot of that will be on websites. You can, there's a lot of the First Nations now that are looking at their own governance system, so their own citizenship process again, which could be quite different from what we have out there. So it's, I think, a statement that, you know, establishing themselves again and getting recognized for who they are, their nationhood. And so that entails all of this in terms of identifying their citizenship. I mean, you see now as well, the Métis, right, are going through issues related to citizenship and their nationhood. And so those are tough and very substantial issues related to peoples. And federal legislation, you know, is kind of finds its way in there. And the First Nations people, at least, are saying it doesn't belong. And so it's becoming a huge conversation.
Well, Loretta, I was going to ask you, because there has been talk about abolishing the Indian Act. Subsequent governments have, you know, they've all mentioned it. How do the Indigenous people feel about that? Is that supported? Would that be supported? Or do you think it'd be opposition to it as well?
Well, I mean, the Indian Act has been in place since 1876. So it's been around for some time, and it's become the tool for engagement between First Nation and non-First Nation people. In Manitoba and in most of the country, we have treaties. And it's those treaties that were to be that focal point, but the Crown hasn't recognized it. And so I think First Nations people will, at the very least, keep the Indian Act until they get to a point where they have a different form of relating to each other. And it won't be the Indian Act, because there are so many inequities, there's so many things wrong with the Indian Act, but there's nothing formal in place that could replace it. And, you know, so the government hasn't quite given the treaties, which from a First Nation perspective should be the formal arrangement, but the Crown is not there yet. And so I think that's where they're moving away from the Indian Act to looking again at what the treaties had spelled out and had intended to be that relationship.
Oh, and I do have another question, and I don't, maybe it's either to Suzanne or to Loretta. They're asking, is there Métis status and Inuit status, or is it just for First Nations?
I can maybe talk a little bit about Métis status, at least here in Manitoba. Like most provinces do have an organization. In Manitoba, we have the Manitoba Métis Federation. And so there is an application process. You have to fill out an application, and you have to submit a genealogy. So there's a few organizations in Manitoba. The most popular one, there's La Société Historique de Saint-Boniface, like the St. Boniface Historical Society provides genealogy services. So you can get, they I think have the best kind of information and database. And so you can order your genealogy from there, and you submit that to the Manitoba Métis Federation, and they go through it to see whether or not you have a connection to Métis communities, and then so I have a Métis card. I'm sure a lot of people still, you know, identity, kind of like Loretta's talking about, is such a complicated thing. Like obviously some people can identify as Métis without having a card that tells them that they're Métis. And yet on the other hand, you probably have a lot of people that are carrying a Métis card in their wallet and don't ever identify as Métis in any way. So it's a complicated question, once again, but yeah, there is a process in terms of validating your connection to Métis lineage and Métis communities through this genealogy that you have to submit to the MMF.
Okay. Well,
I'm not sure about Inuit, and I don't know
yeah,
if Loretta can speak to that.
I want to throw it out to our panel now. We discussed so much about citizenship and Indian status and belonging and a sense of belonging and being proud. Looking at September 30th, now being recognized as Truth and Reconciliation Day, for our Indigenous communities, definitely they have an idea. But for the non-Indigenous, the newcomers, like I said, what is, I guess, in your own words, give us some direction on how we should approach that day? I mean, for most of us, we kind of know, or we do know, and we feel what has happened in this past year. But truly, in your own words, I'm curious, because I was hoping that we would have a Healing Hearts like the day before this day. And of course, you know, we can go on to how it was a political move and, you know, whether it was a good move. You can add that into it. But I think from what I want to ask from you is how we as Canadian citizens, as being born and raised here, approach that day. I'm going to go to Art because you have miles of wisdom. You know, you have brought to light newcomers, especially including Japanese Canadians, our history. So how should we approach that day?
Well, I think it should be a day of education, certainly, of telling stories about the plight of the Indigenous people through the residential school, all of those things. I think it's really important for Canadians to be exposed. Even though it's one day, I mean, it should be something that should be talked about, not just on this particular day, but certainly on this day it's highlighted, which means that you'll get a lot more attention through the media and so on. So we should take advantage of it. Well, I shouldn't say ironically, but today happens to be, for our community, the Japanese community, the day that we achieved redress from the Canadian government. The agreement was signed on September 22nd, 1988. And so in our community, we still celebrate that day through different kinds of activities, whether it be, I think in Toronto, they're having a special performance and reckoning of the event. And across the country, I mean, we talk about it. It's not a national day, but still a day of remembering. And I think the problem is that many people, especially younger people, forget this very easily, you know, like September 22nd, 1988. Well, you know, that's a long time ago now. But our aim is to ensure that that's one way of recognizing what happened and also to talk about it. So I see the same kind of role that the Truth and Reconciliation Day should have too, is a day of recognizing not only the past, but the commitment that our country has made towards trying to meet the recommendations. I attended the Truth and Reconciliation when it was held in Winnipeg. I spoke at one of the sessions there, talking about what happened to my own community, because there's a lot of parallels in terms of destruction of our community at the time, loss of language as well, and all those things that affected people in the Indigenous communities as well. So there is some parallels, but I think it should be a day of being able to, it's not, I wouldn't say a day of celebration, but it should be a day of recognition, a day where the media should be focusing on that day, and so that other Canadians will remember it. And I think that's something that we need to do.
Thank you, Art. Loretta?
I think, yeah, I agree with Art. I think it's a day of remembering and educating, and certainly understanding the history of this country beyond it becoming a country, that there's a huge history that stems back to since time began. But there's also relations between, you know, like you think of Indigenous people and the Japanese community in that time period in history, and not too many people understand that and know those unique relations that had developed
Yes.
in history. And it's good to honor those that history as well, and to remember and to educate the different relations and alliances, if you will, that developed throughout different periods of you know, the history and on these lands. So it's there's a lot of information there, other than what we get from, you know, Confederation and kind of the history book stuff. But I think it's going beyond the history books, and it's reaching out and getting into the community so that the community can learn from each other and talk to each other. And I think that's where you start to build those positive relations, because you find out that there's a lot more alliances, there's a lot more commonality than there are differences. And so we tend to focus on the differences. This is what you're getting, we're not getting this, you know, that type of thing, rather than having an appreciation for our history and our commonalities.
Yes,
I was going to mention one thing, Tracy.
Yeah.
We're having a sharing circle next Thursday on the day with the Indigenous community and the Asian Canadian community. So in a way, it's our way of recognizing that day. It just turned out that way. But.
No, and to add to that, it's with the young people. So
yes,
they are
young leaders, yeah.
So it's, you know, and for some of them, they might not know all of this past history. So
that's true.
It will be a learning session as well. And lastly, to Suzanne, and maybe we can take the spin on this day. What does it mean to not only new citizens that you have, you know, sworn in, like a crazy amount of people, but also, yeah, for the newcomers too, that haven't been yet sworn in, and maybe not know what this whole day is about.
So I'll just, I guess, start by saying that before I even became a citizenship judge, I was a lawyer with the Department of Justice, and part of the work that I did there was with the independent assessment process. Now, I don't know if that's something that's familiar maybe to Loretta, but maybe not to others. It was a component of the Indian Residential School Settlement Act. Everyone's familiar with the TRC. People are less familiar with the IAP. The IAP was a process that was set up to compensate survivors of Indian residential school who injured or suffered physical and sexual abuse while they were at the school. So in that work, I heard 200 plus firsthand accounts from survivors about what their lives were like before school, what life was like at school, the abuse they suffered, how it had affected them for the rest of their lives, and then what they felt they needed in terms to heal from it and move forward. So that affects you, okay? Doesn't affect you the same way as it affects an actual survivor or family members of survivors, but it still affects you to hear all those stories. So that's always been an issue that's been very near and dear to my heart, even though I have no personal experience with residential schools and no one in my family as far as I'm aware of. And that's part of the reason why I mentioned earlier that I like to bring in into my citizenship ceremonies, I like to talk about reconciliation, and I talk about the residential schools. And I know, Tracy, you've asked us to talk about this in terms of in our own words, but I always use the words of the Honorable Murray Sinclair. I quote him at every single one of my ceremonies. I think he's the only person I've ever quoted in my ceremonies. And I do it because when I talk about reconciliation, and I use kind of one of the, I mean, obviously he's talked about reconciliation a whole lot, but one of the things that he says about reconciliation is that it turns on a very simple concept, which is, I want to be your friend and I want you to be mine. And so I like to say that at all of my ceremonies. One, because I think it's beautiful and it's profound in its simplicity. And especially when you're dealing with newcomers, even though they've been in Canada for some time, there are still language barriers sometimes, but people understand what it means to be a friend, right? It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter if you're very conscious and aware of Canadian history or you're not. It doesn't matter if English is your first or third language. Like, we all know what it means to be a friend. And so I guess that's what I would say to newcomers or to new Canadian citizens or even to people born here. Like, just what does it mean to be a friend? And when your friend is hurting, what do you do? Like, you listen, you comfort, you keep an open mind, you talk about it even though it's uncomfortable, all of those things. So that's what I think I would tell people in terms of what to do on September 30th.
Oh, so beautiful. And it is. I mean, we talk about love, we talk about empathy, understanding, and a community. And I think hopefully all of this will resonate on September 30th. I just want to say a big thank you to all of you. I mean, this was like a fascinating topic. And like I said at the beginning, Art, like when you're born and raised here, you don't really think about citizenship or who I belong with or whatever. You just kind of assimilate, right? But this truly now opens our eyes that there are other avenues, there are other ways of thinking, and we just need to explore those and understand them and accept. My favorite phrase is acceptance without understanding sometimes. And this certainly was a conversation of just that. So thank you so much. Thank you to IPW, who is a partner, and Clayton Sandy, our knowledge keeper, for keeping this show on the go. And I know that we'll be calling back to all of you at some point to talk more about this. But in the meantime, thank you so much for this, everybody. September 30th, Truth and Reconciliation Day. We have our panel that have given you lots of inspiration to celebrate and to educate. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Take care. Yeah. And nice meeting you, Suzanne.
Yes, you as well.
Loretta. Yeah.